Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to be starting on my first sewing project for spring. Now, it is only the end of February when I'm filming this, so I might have to wait a while before I can actually wear this dress. But I've been seeing a lot of spring sewing content on YouTube. I know people in other areas of the world are starting to get excited about their spring sewing and spring fashion, so I thought I'd jump on board and make my first spring project as well. So today we're going to be sewing up this new look 6731 pattern. Now, I have actually made this pattern before. I didn't make a whole video on it, but as you can see, it's this gorgeous strappy dress. It's got a high neckline, but then the back is entirely open, and it's got these really cool cutouts on the side, and basically the entire back of the dress is just held together with elastic. So it's really cool. So like I said, I've already made this pattern, so I've tested it. I know I love it. And in terms of fabric, we are going to be using this gorgeous stretch cotton poplin fabric. I got this a few years ago. It was actually a gift from my mom, and when I first got it, I loved it, but I really didn't know what I could make from it. And the reason is that it's a pretty heavyweight poplin, so it's got a ton of weight to it. So since it's such a thick poplin, I just didn't see it working well for something flowy or sheer, but I think it'll work perfectly for this dress because in my opinion, the fabric for this dress needs a little bit of structure in order to maintain the shape of the neckline and give you enough support and coverage and everything like that. So I'm super excited to be finally using this fabric for a pattern I really love. And then for the lining, I got another white cotton poplin, and it has a little bit of stretch, so it's pretty similar to the main fabric, although this is a little bit of a lighter weight cotton poplin. So we'll use this to line our dress. Now, this pattern itself doesn't actually include instructions on how to line your dress, so I'm going to show you guys how to do that today because it's really easy and I think it makes a big difference in the finished result of the dress. Because this dress is backless, you may want to wear it without a bra, and then because of that, you want to make sure the front is not see-through at all. So that's why I think having a lining in this dress just makes sense. Now, other than loving this pattern, the other reason I chose this project for today is that it's incredibly beginner friendly, and I got a lot of messages from you guys asking what are the most beginner friendly projects you can make, if I have a pattern suggestion for a dress that's easy to make. And this is definitely a great project for beginners. And let's just jump right in and get working on this dress. Okay guys, so I just cut out my pattern pieces. I've got them here with me. Let me show you what you'll need to make this dress. So firstly, we have the front piece, and this is a really long piece, and it's just cut a long fold in the center front. And you can see this is the neckline, here's the top shoulder seam, and this goes out to the side underneath your bust. And then also cut that front piece the exact same way from your lining fabric. Then we've got the back skirt piece, again, cut on fold from our main fabric. And then you'll want to cut the back skirt piece on fold from your lining as well. So all those pieces make up the main dress. So there's just a front and a back of the main and the lining. Told you this was going to be an easy dress. So the only other thing you need for this project are these strips of fabric, and these are going to form the elastic casing. So as you can see in the design of this dress relies a lot on elastic casings along your back as well as along your back waist to hold the back skirt up. So you're going to be using a ton of elastic for this project. So these strips are basically going to form your elastic casing. So there is one thing I want to show you. I did modify the front bust pattern piece a little bit just because I've made this pattern before, and I found that the bust came out really wide on me and it felt a little bit awkward. So I scooped out a bit of width from the side of the bust. So let me show you what that looks like on the flat pattern pieces, and then we need to interface, and then we can jump into the sewing. So let me show you that now. Okay guys, so this is the pattern piece for the front of the dress. This white part is where I've made some modifications. So just to orient you, this is the center front cut on fold. This is the neckline, the shoulder seam, and then the underarm area. So I just put the original pattern piece underneath. So you can see the main change I've made here is scooping out about an inch. And again, this is beside your bust. So I just felt like this area came out really wide on me and is kind of digging into my underarm. So I scooped out about an inch, and then I blended out that scooping into the original shoulder seam, and I ended up moving the point and this is where the elastic is going to attach. This just got moved over a little bit, which I don't think should affect the construction of the dress too much. So this is where we're going to eventually attach some casing to put in elastic. So if anything, I might have to shorten my casing by like 1 centimeter, so it's not a big deal. Now, I didn't test out this scooping, so hopefully it fits well. And I want to say, if you're a beginner, don't worry about this. Just make the pattern as it's written. I think it fits fine. But since I'm a little bit more advanced, I just wanted to take the time to scoop out this side and see how it fits. But if you're a beginner, don't worry about any of this. Just cut out the pattern as it is in your regular size, and that'll work out just fine. Okay, so I just attached my interfacing to the wrong side of my lining, and I only decided to interface my lining because I just think if I interfaced both the main and the lining, it would give a little bit too much structure. So I think simply doing the lining is going to be enough. So a couple things I thought were worth mentioning. Like I said in the beginning of the video, the main pattern actually calls for a facing, not a lining. But I'm going to show you guys how to make a lining because I strongly believe this dress should be lined, and it's very easy to do. So the original pattern comes with these facing pieces. So you would cut this out if you wanted to make a facing, but you can also use this piece to cut out your interfacing. I used this piece as a guide, but since I modified the side of my front pattern piece, I had to modify the shape of my interfacing a little bit. So that's why you saw me kind of just measuring it myself and cutting it out. But if you're just cutting out the normal pattern, you didn't make any modifications, then you should definitely use this facing piece for your interfacing. Last time I made this dress, I actually didn't do any interfacing along the neckline because my fabric was really sheer and I was worried that the interfacing would show through. But since my fabric this time is a lot thicker, a lot more opaque, I'm not too worried about that. So I want to try interfacing and see if it gives some stability to kind of the sides of the bust and the neckline itself. Okay, we've got all our pattern pieces, our interfacing is on, so it's time to get sewing. And very excitingly, I actually just purchased a serger, so I'm very excited to kind of feature the serger in this video. So I'm going to go ahead before I start sewing and finish all of my edges with my new serger so that all the edges are finished nicely. But the last time I made this dress, I didn't have a serger, so I did French seams, so you could do that. Or you could also just zigzag the raw edges of your pieces to get a nice seam finish like that. But since I just got my serger and I want to play around with it, I want to try it out, I am going to serge all my raw edges today. So let's jump into the serging. Okay guys, this is my new serger. It's a Kenmore serger. I bought it secondhand off of someone who is selling it on Facebook Marketplace. And I feel so lucky to finally have a serger in my collection. I've been sewing for about 5 years and I held off on getting a serger for a long time, but now that I finally have it, I think it's going to be so useful. So I'm going to get my serger all set up and ready to go, and then I'm going to serge the raw edges of my pieces. Okay, so I just finished the seams of all the pattern pieces using my serger. So I did, the back skirt of the main fabric, the front piece of the main fabric, and then I also did my 2 lining pieces as well. One other thing I forgot to mention is that this dress does include instructions to add pockets, which is pretty cool because I know a lot of people feel like they absolutely have to have pockets in a dress. I'm skipping it for this particular dress. Basically, you just have the elastic that's keeping this on your body. So I think if you were to put a phone in one of the pockets, it would kind of drag down the side of the dress and just not look that good. So that's why I skipped the pockets. But now we're ready to get started. So I'm going to put my back skirt piece against my front piece, right sides together, and then we'll pin and sew up the side seams. And I'm going to repeat the same process for the lining dress as well, so my white pieces. So let's get started on that. So once that's pinned in place, we're going to sew along the side seams of both the main dress and the lining dress at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. That's the seam allowance for this pattern, and then we'll press our seam open. Okay, so I just finished sewing together the front and back pieces, and this is what it's looking like. So I have the top part here of the front, here is the skirt part, and it's attached to the back skirt at the side seams. And as you saw, I pressed my seams so they're laying nice and flat, which is great. And then I also just did the exact same thing for my lining pieces. So you should have a main fabric that's starting to resemble a dress, and then the lining piece that's starting to resemble a dress. Okay, now it's time for a fun step because we get to sew the main dress and the lining dress together. So we're going to place these right sides together, and we're going to sew along the neckline seam as well as the side of the bodice here up until this point, just at our normal 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and just leave this top part open because we're going to be sandwiching our straps in between these two pieces at the end. Now, if you were kind of going by the regular pattern and you were using a facing, this is kind of where you would do your facing instead of doing a lining, but since I'm doing a lining, we're going to sew our main and lining pieces together. So let's do that now. So now that we've got that pinned, I'm going to sew along both of the bodice side seams and around the curved neckline. Okay, so we've got our main and lining pieces sewn right sides together along these seams as well as the neck seam. Now you can definitely tell I'm still new at serging because I'm going to need to clip this neckline seam in order for it to lay flat on the right side. So it's too bad that I already spent all that time serging it, but we are going to carefully cut into our seam allowances, just adding some little notches. And as well as this curved edge, we're going to notch that curved edge as well. And here at the corner, I'm going to trim off the seam allowances just to grade them down a little bit near the corner. Okay, so I've turned that inside out. Now I want to press these edges flat. And when you're pressing, be careful because you don't want any of this white lining fabric to show up on the right side. So when you are pressing, if anything, it's okay to see a little bit of the main fabric on the lining side, but you don't want to see any of the white lining fabric on the main side. And because we clipped our seam allowances, this should be easy to press. So let's do that now. Okay, as you can see, this is all nicely pressed. Now, before we move on, we are actually going to turn this inside out one more time because later when we go to attach the straps, we're going to sandwich them inside this top part. So I want to turn under this raw edge and press it. And that's just going to be easier to do now from inside out than later on. So let's turn this inside out one more time. So here's the strap inside out again. So this is why we went and graded the seam allowance down before. So we just want to turn this raw edge under and try to turn this under at about 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, since that's the seam allowance from the original pattern. So that's pretty good, and try to get it as neat as you can, and it'll make it much easier later on. I'm just using a knitting needle to really get my edge flat there, and then give this a really good press. So then, as you can see, when we turn this back out, we have this edge nice and pressed under, which will really help us later when we go to sandwich the straps in there. Okay, so next we need to make this strap. So it's going to be the casing for the elastic. The pattern has you cut out 2 of these longer rectangle pieces and then 2 slightly shorter rectangle pieces. Cut these out of your main fabric. You don't need to cut out your lining for this part. So essentially we're going to attach all 4 of these strips together. So we're going to place these right sides together and join these long pieces, and this is going to be the center back. And then each of these shorter pieces we're going to stitch right sides together against the end of the long pieces. So it'll be 2 long pieces in the middle and then the shorter strips on either side to form one long continuous strip. And this is going to be the elastic casing for the dress. So let's go ahead and get started on that now. Okay, here you can see we have one very long strap. I took it to my iron and I pressed the seam allowances open just so it looks neat and tidy. So now what we're going to do is we need to find the shorter tie end that's on either side of this really long strip. And we need to close up the ends of this tie. So basically what we're going to do, starting at this seam here, we're going to fold this over and pin this strip right sides together, and then we're going to sew from this seam all the way to the end of the tie over here. We're going to leave this end open, and once we're done that, we can turn this back out to the right side, and we should have this end of the tie nicely closed up, and this end of the tie will still be open. So let's do that now. Okay, one other thing I wanted to show you guys is that this pattern technically calls for 2 centimeter wide elastic, and I do have a little bit of that here, and that's what this looks like. But the last time I made this project, I actually used 2.5 centimeter wide elastic. I just think it provides a little bit more stability and maybe looks a little bit nicer, especially in the back. So I'm going to do that again. And so what we're going to do now is turn the end of our tie right sides out. Before I do that, I am going to just quickly serge the edges so that the inside of the tie is all neat and tidy, but we'll turn these ends right side out and press them, but we'll keep the middle of our tie open like this. So I measured and marked where my ties are going to hit this corner piece on the bodice right here. So when I measured, I marked it with my marker, and what I need to do is just carefully, very carefully clip into the seam allowance just at that point. And you want to clip right up to your seam line. And we'll do that on both sides of the tie. Okay, so I finished that, and here's what the strap is looking like. So again, the end of our strap, we sewn right sides together at 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then I just finished the seam with my serger. And I clipped very carefully into the seam allowance here of this middle part. So if you're doing the pattern as written, you would just clip into this seam line here. This would be the exact point where this intersects with the side of your project, but because I modified my bodice a bit, mine is just a little bit further over, so I clipped there, and then this part is still open. So now what we need to do is turn this section of the strap out to the right side and then press it flat. So let's do that now. Okay, so now we've turned out this loop, we should press it so that it looks neat and tidy. Okay guys, so I just finished pressing the ends of my tie, and in the middle section of the tie, what's happened is that we've sewn and pressed the end, and because we clipped our seam allowance, the seam allowances for the main section of our tie are still included. It hasn't been sewn together, and I pressed it flat with the wrong sides together. So what I'm going to do quickly now is just baste this section of the tie in the seam allowances together. Okay guys, so the middle section of my tie has been loosely basted together, as you can see, and that will just make this next step easier. So now it's finally time to attach our casing to the main dress. So how I've got my dress oriented here, it's inside out, so the right side of the main fabric and the right side of the lining are facing each other on the inside. What we're going to need to do is sandwich this tie between the right side of these two layers, like that. So I'm going to start at the center back, which I do have marked out here. Okay, so this is the back of the skirt here, and the center back of my tie is going to be this seam line. And I do have some notches I can use to match up all these pieces together. So I'm going to work on that now. I feel like I always say this, guys, but take your time at this step. Just make sure everything is lining up properly. All the raw edges should be exactly aligned, and just use a lot of pins, because with 4 layers of fabric going through the machine, things are going to shift around a lot, and you really want to get a neat result with this dress. So just take your time, there's no rush. spend some time carefully pinning this, and then we'll be ready to sew it together. So when it comes to kind of where this tie raw edge ends, we don't want this part of the tie that's already finished to be caught in the seam allowance at all. So I'm going to just pin it out of the way. I'm going to pin it on a diagonal like that, just to make things easier for myself when I take it over to the sewing machine, that's all. So without a doubt, the part that's going to be the most awkward here is sandwiching this corner of the raw edge into this corner, which is the bottom corner near the bust area. And so we really just want to line up this raw edge as carefully as we can. And if we don't end up getting a neat finish on the first sew through, there is another little trick we can do at the end to make this corner look better. But for now, just really try to get it in there, make sure it's sandwiched in. All that careful measuring I did is paying off because everything is lining up really, really well. Okay guys, so once we have everything pinned into place, and we're just going to sew all the way along this really long seam, starting at kind of the underarm area, all the way along the curved cutout, along the back of the skirt, and then all the way up again the other side, finishing at the other underarm area. And we've got our main fabric and lining fabric right sides together, and sandwiched between them we have the tie. So let's take this to the sewing machine and sew this up now. Alright, I got that big long seam sewed together. It actually took a bit longer than I expected, but now's the fun part because we get to turn the dress right side out and see what we're working with. So let's see what the dress is looking like from the right side. Okay, so here's what it's looking like. I'm getting so excited. Oh my gosh. So we have the top of the bodice which we had finished already a long time ago. And you can see here at the corners that our straps are attached. Now it's possible that your corner could be looking a little bit messy. One of my corners looks perfect. The other one looks a little bit messy. So I'm going to turn this back inside out and just try to stitch closer to that seam allowance. And I'll show you how I'm going to kind of neaten up that corner a bit. And then all along the curved edge, as well as the back of the skirt, you should have your elastic casing on top, and on the right side of the dress, you should have your dress fabric, and then on the inside, you should have your lining fabric like that. So what we need to do now is give this a good press. So we want to press the main fabric down and the lining fabric down, just so this seam lays flat. I am going to turn mine back inside out to fix that corner seam, and I think I'm going to serge the raw edge as well and cut off some of the seam allowance on the inside. So I just wanted to turn it inside out to make sure everything looked good before I did anything too drastic, and I do think it's looking good. So we'll turn it inside out, hopefully for the last time, fix those couple issues, neaten up the seam allowances, and then we can insert the elastic and we're almost done. Okay, so you can see this is one of my corners of my bodice, and that looks pretty neat and tidy. Unfortunately, my other corner, what happened here is I wasn't able to stitch close enough to the raw edge, so I need to turn this back inside out and try to do a little bit of a better job of that. On the inside, I might be able to trim some of the seam allowances in here because this is incredibly bulky. So when I do that, I'm going to try to trim some of those seam allowances. And then here's what the skirt is looking like. This is the elastic casing, this is the lining on the inside, and this is the main on the outside. So let's turn this inside out again, hopefully for the last time. Okay, so I am going to trim this seam down a little bit and serge the raw edge. I probably didn't need to serge it before because now I'm just cutting off my serging and doing it again, but that's okay. I'm learning as I go here. So I'm going to neaten up that seam. And then the other thing I need to do is fix that one corner. So I wasn't able to stitch close enough to the raw edge for one of these corners. So I just need to make sure I do that properly. So I'm going to do that now. So I just unpicked this corner. I fiddled around with it a bit, and I'm going to try stitching it again. And for my other corner that I am happy with, I'm going to reinforce this stitch line And then I'm going to grade down my seam allowances just so that it's less bulky when I turn it out to the right side. So I'm going to do that now. I just fixed these corner areas I was talking about before, and they look really neat and tidy now. So finally, it's time for such a fun step. We get to thread our elastic all the way along the casing. So I have this inch wide woven elastic, and what I like about this type of elastic is that when you stretch it, it stays about the same width. So I think that's really important for a dress like this because the elastic is going to be under a lot of pressure from all the stretching and everything like that. So the pattern suggested length of elastic for my size is 67.5 inches, but I am going to cut my elastic quite a bit longer than that, maybe like 75 inches, because I want to have some wiggle room because everyone's elastic is a little bit different and yours might be more or less stretchy than the elastic that the pattern makers tested it with. So I do think it's good to leave yourself some wiggle room. You can always cut it off at the end, and you'll probably want to try on the dress with the elastic in before you go and sew it. So I'm going to cut mine about 75 inches long, and I'm going to start the process of threading the elastic through the casing now. So here's my 75-inch long piece of elastic. I just personally like to use a safety pin to thread my elastic through, so that's what I'm going to do. So sometimes I cut the end of my elastic like this. It just makes it easier to thread through the casing. Okay guys, I'm finally done threading my elastic. I always find this step is so much work, but what I've done is I've stitched the elastic inside the casing at one of the ends of the ties, and the other one is just left open because I want to try the dress on pinned and see if I have the right length of elastic before I make any cuts or do anything permanent. And I need to distribute the gathers evenly. So this is one side of my casing right now, and this is the other side. So clearly things aren't evenly distributed. So I'm going to take a minute and do that now. So let's see, I cut out about 7 to 8 more inches of elastic than the pattern suggests. So I'm just going to mark where that is on my elastic, just so I know. And I'm going to pin my elastic onto the marking. So this would have been the original length of elastic that the pattern suggested. So I'm just going to pin that on like that. And I'll spend some time distributing the gathers just so we can see how it looks. Okay, so finally I think the elastic is distributed well enough that I can try it on. So basically what I'm going to do here is just pin the ends of my elastic casing to the top of my shoulder seams, just pin it in place temporarily before we sew anything. Our strap, it needs to crisscross across the back, and then it needs to be sandwiched inside of this armhole piece. So I just graded down the edges of that a little bit just to make it easier to put in this shoulder seam. Okay, so once it's sandwiched in, it should look something like this, and then we're just going to top stitch down this so that the strap is caught inside of the shoulder seam, and we're going to do that on both sides. Once the top stitching is done, it should look something like this. So it's not completely invisible, but if we've used a matching thread and done a neat job, it's really not obvious in the grand scheme of things. So my straps are successfully sewn onto my bodice, which is great, so we're just about done the dress. But before you move on from these straps, one thing I would recommend you do is try on the dress and spend a little bit of time adjusting the gathers. Because for a dress like this, it really depends where the fabric is distributed to make it look good on your body. And then once you're happy with the gathers, I would pin them in place while you're wearing the dress. And then with some matching thread, we're going to want to do some sneaky top stitching. So we can top stitch in some of these seams right through the elastic so that the elastic isn't shifting around as much as we wear the dress. The last thing this dress needs is a hem, so we'll have to hem both the lining fabric and the main fabric. Now, whenever I have a lining in my dress, I usually just hem it separately from the main fabric and I just let it hang as its own layer. There's different ways you can finish lining, but this is what has worked well for me, and I like this approach because if you ever want to open the dress back up, turn it inside out, and make any modifications, you can do that without having to unpick your whole hem. You're able to just get in at the insides of your dress without any fuss. So that's how I like to do my linings, but if you have a different way to finish your lining, by all means go for it. One thing I usually do before I hem a lining though, is I usually like to cut off about a centimeter of my lining, or half an inch or less, maybe a quarter of an inch. So my lining is just a tiny bit shorter, like a hair shorter than my main fabric. And when I hem them, that will just ensure that the lining is never going to show from the outside of the dress when you're wearing it. Okay, so it's finally time to do the hem. So I have my lining piece here. And like I mentioned, I'm going to cut off about 1 centimeter from the bottom of the entire lining hem. So what I'll do for my hem, I'll turn under my raw edge by about 1 centimeter once, I'll press that, and then I'll turn the hem over a second time at about 1.5 centimeter, and then I'll press and pin that down, and then I'll sew my hem like that, and then you'll have a neat finish from both sides. Okay guys, with all that done, the dress is complete and it's time for the big reveal. Okay guys, I finally finished my work on this beautiful spring dress, and here is the finished result. I am so happy with how this dress turned out. I think it's absolutely stunning. Unfortunately, you can't really get the full effect on the hangers, so I hope you did enjoy the try-on clips to get the full effect of the dress. So first, let's talk about this pattern. So as you can see, this pattern is a really strappy dress. It's got cutouts at the side, and then my version A, has an open back. And I wanted to note that you can actually make this dress with a closed back. So if you're someone who doesn't like to show too much skin, you can make the view B of this dress, which covers up the back a little bit more. So I like that they include those two options. So it's also a really excellent beginner pattern. There's no buttons, no zipper, no challenging closures. It just slips on over the head with the elastic. So my measurements correspond well to a size 14, so that's the size that I made. So I think if you go by your measurements and compare that to the measurements on the pattern envelope, you'll do okay. Now let's talk about kind of construction tips and what modifications I made. So first of all, you guys know, you saw that I did narrow the top neckline of the dress a little bit. On the first version of this pink dress that I made, I found that the neckline was coming up really wide and the fabric was kind of bunching under my arms and it was just really uncomfortable. And I did compare the size 14 to the size 12, but I found that going down a size wouldn't have really narrowed this part of the neckline. So I just tried on my pink dress and I kind of measured how much I wanted gone from the sides, and it was about 1 inch. So then I used my curved ruler to remove 1 inch from the center of that pattern piece, and then I blended in that curved edge to the shoulder seam and blended it in down at the side as well. And overall, the result turned out really, really well. The modifications to the pattern are pretty much perfect for me, so I feel really happy that I have a perfectly fitting pattern. Now, I will say, if you have a larger chest or if you're a larger size in this pattern, you might want to play around with like adding a dart, doing a large bust adjustment. There's lots of things you could potentially do that wouldn't be too challenging, but you may find that you need a little bit of extra room in the front if you do have a bigger chest, so that's something to consider. The other major modification I made is that I added a lining to my dress. So the original dress doesn't come with instructions for a lining, which I'm kind of surprised by because this is a really easy garment to line. You know, some projects you think of lining them like a coat and it's a ton of work. A dress like this, it's really, really simple to line, and I think adding a lining to the dress adds a lot of opacity in the front, which is really important, especially if you're not going to be wearing it with a bra. And also it gives it such a clean look on the inside. It hides all those raw seams that you're going to have where the elastic casing is. So I really prefer my technique of making this with a lining. So I hope that part was helpful for you guys too. I also used a 1-inch wide elastic, which differs from what the pattern recommends. And I'd also suggest using a woven type of elastic. So that's the type that when you stretch it, it doesn't get any narrower, it just stays the same width, because your elastic is going to be under a lot of tension all the time in this project. So you really want something strong that's gonna last for a long time and that's gonna kind of bounce back and maintain its shape well. So this dress is nearly perfect, but if I could go back and do one thing differently, so instead of having one really long piece of elastic, I would actually cut the length of that in two, and then I would sew it together along the back seam. And the reason for that is that in this project, you're using such a long piece of elastic, but it's really important that you've distributed it evenly across the dress. And in order to do that, you need to make sure the center piece of your elastic is lining up with the center back of your skirt piece. And that's just really, really hard to do. If your fabric is a little bit transparent, you might be able to mark the elastic with a marker and then see through the fabric. But for example, in the fabric I used, I wouldn't have been able to really see a marking through. So I think by kind of sewing the elastic together, you would have that thick part, so you would be able to match up the part that you sewed together with the back seam. Okay, I've said the word elastic 100 times, so let's move on. So let's talk about the fabric I used. As I mentioned, this is kind of a heavier weight, stiff cotton poplin, and it has a little bit of stretch on the cross grain, so width-wise. And this fabric ended up working out really well for this project. So the first time I made this dress, I made it in a cotton voile, which is very, very lightweight, and I lined it in a cotton voile. So the resulting dress, it's super breezy, it's really lightweight to wear in the summer. The skirt drapes a little bit differently. I am going to put in a side-by-side here so you can compare as I'm talking about it. And it just has a really relaxed, kind of comfortable look. But I will say, with the first pink dress I made, I didn't interface the neckline because I was worried about the interface showing through. And I think that you have to interface this neckline. Otherwise, it's going to bunch up, it's going to ride up, and it's not going to stay in place. So you really, really do need to interface the neckline. So I would make sure that you're using a fabric that's thick enough that you can add some interfacing and it's not going to show through or anything like that. And the other thing about the voile is, even though I lined the dress, it's still pretty transparent. So it is a little bit risky to wear it braless. You might need to wear like nipple covers or something like that in order to make sure that you're covering up the way you want to. Overall, I do think the poplin worked really well for this project. The finished product of the dress just feels a little bit more structured and a little bit more supportive. The only thing I'll say is that the poplin I used was fairly heavyweight, and I also lined it in a poplin as well. So the overall dress is pretty heavy. It doesn't feel as breezy as the other version did. So I think both fabrics could potentially work, but depending on what look you're going for, if you want something more structured and something that's going to be more opaque, I would go with the poplin. If you want something floaty and sheer, go ahead and use the voile, but you might need to think about adding a third layer of lining, a built-in bra, and some way to interface the neckline that you won't see on the right side. So just keep those things in mind. I actually think it could be really fun to try making this pattern in a silk or a satin. I think I had a commenter say that on my previous video where I featured this pattern, so shout out to you, whoever you are, but I think it would look absolutely beautiful in a fabric with a little bit of drape, so I might try that as well. I do have a couple of satiny fabrics in my stash that I don't have any big plans for, so maybe they'll become this dress as well. Okay, now let's quickly talk about the overall look of the dress and the style. So I absolutely love the pairing of this fabric with the pattern. I think the print on this dress is so beautiful. The soft beige is a really wearable color for me because it's kind of like a neutral, but then I love that it has prints with a little bit of pop of pink and some white. I think it's so springy, and it could take you through from early spring, I think, even into some of the warmer days of autumn. But when you're wearing this dress, you are showing a lot of skin. So in terms of styling it, one of my go-tos is always throwing on a turtleneck underneath anything. Turtlenecks are a big part of my style. So I did style it here with a white turtleneck underneath, and I think it looks really cute. Say you're out for a beach day or you're walking through the city and then you want to go for dinner at a nice restaurant, but you don't want to have your whole back out, or maybe it doesn't align with the dress code, I think this type of dress looks really cute with a white linen button-up thrown on top. You can kind of tie the button up or button it up, and that's just a great way to kind of cover up if you need to go somewhere where you don't want to have your whole back out. I think to transition it from early spring into summer, it would even look cute with a sweater thrown over it too. So I think there's lots of different possibilities, but most of the time when I wear this dress, I think I'll have it styled with some summery sandals and just a cute summery bag or basket. Okay guys, what did you think of this project? Please let me know what you thought in the comments down below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, and if you're liking these videos on my channel, please do subscribe. I would really appreciate it, and I would love to have you here. Okay guys, I'll see you in my next one. Bye.